Hey guys and girls, and welcome back to episode 7 in this series where we are building a GraphQL API in Elixir. So I've been wondering what to do in this episode, but the way I like to approach project is by thinking about the user. So at the moment our user, if he enters our app or a web page, he can register and he can list all users out of our database. And of course, that's not something we want to do in production because we want to protect that query. We don't want just random users who are not signed up to be able to see a list of all the users. So we need a way to protect our endpoints or our queries and our mutations. So we need to do authentication. So we need a way for a user to log in and then get a JWT token. And whenever he requests information, we need to send that JWT token to our server, and our server is going to be able to look at that token, see if the user exists in our database, and then a user can safely request data or add data to our database. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. So let's get started by starting a new branch with git flow. So we're going to say git flow feature start, and we're going to call the branch implement user authentication. Okay. And what I like to do is just start with our schema. The schema is the blueprint of what our API looks like. So if we start from here and run our server, we can debug and just go back and see what's missing. It's just the way I like to do it. So we're gonna first implement a description, and let's say login a user and return a JWT token. That's the description. Then we need the fields, and the other one was called register user. So for now, let's call it login user. We need to return a type, and we're going to make a new type, and we're going to call it session type. And of course we need arguments. The user needs to log in, so we need input. That is going to be non-null. And we're going to make a input type for this as well, and we're going to call it session input type. And we need to resolve it. So we're going to make a new resolver, and we're going to point at resolvers dot. Do we want to make a session resolver or put it in the user resolver? I think we are going to make we're going to put it in the user resolver. Otherwise our session resolver is going to be really small. You know what? No, let's be consistent. Let's call it session controller, session resolver. And the function is going to be login underscore user with 3 arguments. Oh, login underscore user with 3 arguments, and let's close that off. Okay, so if we run our server now, I'm going to make a new terminal window. Mix Phoenix server. We are gonna get an error that says session type is undefined. So that's our next thing. Let's make a new type. So in our schema, we have our types index file that imports all the types. We have a user type. So what we need to do is make a session type, session underscore type.ex. And what we're gonna put in here is we're going to make a new dev module that is going to be medium GraphQL API web .schema .types .session type. And in here we need something from Absinthe. That's going to be the notation. Not sure why it's not. Yeah, there we go. Auto completing. And we first need an object that we're going to return. So that's going to be object, the session type. And here we can specify which fields we want to return when a user logs in. So we want to return a field with a token, which is going to be a string. And we want to return, what I like to do, return a user, so that when a user logs in, we actually also get the whole user object back, so that we can, for example, store that in a React Native app, so we know what the first name, the last name of the user is, and the email and stuff like that. And because we already defined a user in our user type, we can actually reference that. So we can reference this object, the user type, by saying here, okay, the field user is going to return a user type. And that is our session type. But we also need an input object, which is a session input type. And in here we define the fields that a user needs to give us in order to run this mutation and get the JWT token back. So if a user logs in, we need a field with an email address that is going to be non-null. And an email address is going to be a string, of course. And we need a field with a password, which is also going to be non-null. And also it's going to be a string. Okay, so we have our two types. Now, of course, because we made an index file, we need to import the session type in this file. So we're going to say import types, and we're going to point to the types.sessionType. So if we run our server now, we get Absinthe notation is not loaded and could not be found. That is strange. Absinthe.schema.notation is what we need, not Absinthe.notation. Absinthe.schema.notation. There we go. So now our server should run. There we go. So if we go to our browser and we go to localhost, we can actually see that in our mutations, there is a login user. So let's try and run that mutation and see what happens. So we can say mutation, login user, which expects an input. And that input has an email. For now, let's say bob@bob.com. And we also specified that we need a password, which is going to be password. And what we get back, we can look at it if we go to our session type that is going to be returned. We get a token back, which is a string. So we can say token. And we're going to get our user type back. And the user type is what we defined in the last episode. So we can say user, and then first name, last name, email. Okay, let's run it. We're going to get an error. Let's have a look at the error in our terminal. And it's going to say the resolver, session resolver login is undefined. And that's correct because we didn't make a resolver yet. So the input types are correct. Now we need to make a session resolver. So in our resolver folder, let's make a new file called session_resolver.ex. So in here, let's specify that it is a dev module again. And that's going to be medium GraphQL API web .resolvers.session resolver. And in here, we're going to have the function that we defined in our schema, which is going to be the function, if we scroll down, login user. So we're going to say login def login underscore user do. So we know that a resolver always takes in 3 arguments. And at the moment, we know if we look at our user resolver that the second argument is always going to be the input of the user. And in the login function, we also are going to get input. We're going to get the email and the password. So we can grab that out of the arguments, and we're going to say input is going to be input. So what do we want to do in this function? We want to, if a user logs in, we want to check if the user is in our database. If a user is registered, we want to return a token, and we want to return the user. So if we remember, I think I told you that in the last episode, a resolver is always going to return a tuple with an OK and then the data that we asked for. And if we look in our schema, and if we look at our session type, the data that we need to provide is a field with a token and a field with a user type. So in here, we know in the end, what we need to return is a tuple with OK, and then a map with the first argument, a token, which is going to be our JWT token, and then the user object. So this is what we want to return. So we need a way to authenticate our user. We're going to get the input, so we know that we're going to get the email and the password. So what we want to do is go into our accounts context, and let's make a new file in here, and we're going to call it session.ex. And we need to make a new dev module, which is going to be medium GraphQL API, not the web folder because we're not in there, .accounts.session. And what we want to do in here is make a function called authenticate, which takes in arguments. And then we want to do something. And what do we want to do? If we look at our session resolver, what we get in is input. So we get an email and a password. So what we want to do with the email and the password, we want to go into our database and check if a user with that email and password exists. So what we can do is say, we want to go into our repository, and the repository has a function called getBy. And in there, you define what data structure you want to get back. So in our case, what do we want to look up? We want to look up a user. And how are we going to look it up? We're going to look it up by the email address, because that's what the user provides. And we want to make sure that we downcase the input of the user, because that's what we did. If we could take a look at our user, in our change set, we actually downcase the email address. So we want to downcase the input as well. So we're going to say string.downcase. And in there, we're going to grab the arguments. And in the arguments, we're going to grab the email address. So arguments.email. And we have arguments, not an argument, plural. So let's be consistent here. So arguments.email. We want to get the user and we want to bind it to the user variable because we're going to use that later. So in this module, we're referencing the repo and the user, but we're grabbing it from nowhere at the moment. So what we want to do is we want to alias the medium GraphQL API .accounts.user. And we also want to alias the medium GraphQL API .repo. And now we have access to those two objects. Okay, so now that we have the user, we grabbed it out of the repo by their email address. We want to check if the password that the user provides in the arguments actually matches up with the password that we have in our database. So we want to make well, you can do this a couple of different ways, but we want to make a case statement, and we're going to pass our user and our password provided by the arguments. So our user that we grab from the repo, that's this one. And we want to grab the arguments that the user provides. And what we want to do is we want to check what comes out of this function. Okay, so we want to make a private function because we're only going to use it in this module. And we're going to call it check passwords because that's what we called it. And in this function, we're going to get the user and the arguments. And what the check passwords is going to do is we can make a case statement, or we can define two separate private functions. It doesn't really matter. It's up to you. I use a case statement. So if we have a user, depending on what the user is, we're going to do different things. So if the user is nil, so if out of the arguments we grab no user, we want to return nothing. But if a malicious user is going to log in with an invalid password and email, and he keeps hitting our database, that's going to be a little bit problematic because he's going to keep querying the database. But coming in comes with a function called come on in dot, we're using the Argon library dot dummy check password, and that fakes like checking the password, which takes some time, so a user just can't keep hitting the database. So that's a nifty feature that we're going to use. So if the user in our case statement is nil, we're going to do this, and otherwise if it's not nil, so if we have a user, we want to check the passwords. So we're going to use the Argon2 library again for coming in, and then there's a check password function that takes in two arguments. And the first argument is going to be the password that the user provides. So that's in our arguments, the password field that the user put in. And then the second argument is going to be the hashed password in our database. And we call it user.password hash. Because if we look at our user, the password hash is the actual thing that is stored in our database. So this function is now going to check if the password that the user provided matches the password that we have in our database. And that's going to return either true or false. So in our case statement up here, what we can say, okay, if the check password function returns true, we want to return a tuple with the user. If we get anything else, we are going to return an error with a message. We can provide a string. We can say incorrect. login credentials. Let's save that. And we have this problem again, and I'm not sure why it is doing that. Okay, so let's go over this. If we want to authenticate a user, we get as arguments a password and an email. We look up the user in our database because we need to grab the password out of our database. Then we're going to check our password with the user that we got out of our database and the arguments that the user provided. It's going to run this function. It's going to look at the user argument. If the user argument does not exist, if we couldn't find the user in our database, it's going to do a dummy check and return an error. If there is a user, so the other case, it's going to try and match the password in our arguments with the password that is provided by the user and is in our database. And that is going to return an OK. So then we go back in here. If it's true, we're going to return OK and the user. If not, we're going to return error, incorrect login credentials. So that's it for now. In the next episode, what I want to do is actually implement the JWT token. So at the moment, when a user logs in, we check if the email and the password are correct. We check if the password matches the password in our database, but we're not actually returning a JWT token yet. And that's what we're going to do in the next episode. I first wanted to do it in one episode, but it's already 20 minutes, so I'm not going to do that in the same episode. If you like this episode, please leave a comment, subscribe, or like this video. And I hope to see you in the next one where we will implement our JWT token. Thank you for watching. Bye.